Hello, my name is Houang and I'm a teaching artist with the Houston Center for Photography. Welcome back to our Levy Park Photography workshop. Today our workshop is about understanding exposure and light metering. And I hope you will join me on Saturday morning for a live Q&A on Zoom. All the information is available on the Houston Center for Photography website under Education, Levy Park Workshop. Thank you very much and see you Saturday. Okay, we're now about to start our presentation. As I mentioned earlier, our topic for today is understanding exposure and learning how to use the light metering system in our camera. So what is exposure? Well, to start, I'd like to say that making an image really hasn't changed much since it started about 100 years ago. So when the light enters the lens, through a hole within the lens that we call aperture, the camera shutter is open during a certain amount of time to admit light. That's what we call shutter speed. The light entering into the camera exposes the sensor and an image is recorded. The recorded image is called exposure. So a consistent way to make a correct exposure is really to shoot fully manual, or at least in semi-manual modes. If you are unfamiliar with these three modes, manual, aperture priority, or shutter speed priority, I highly recommend you to read your manual or watch my first video for the Levy Park Photography workshops that is called Getting to Know Your Camera. Let's look at the exposures that we have in front of us. So the middle image is the correctly exposed one, where we have a very pleasing light to the eye and we have the definition in the shadows and our highlights are good. On the left-hand side, we have an underexposed image. It starts to be too dark and we are losing details in the shadows. And when you are going to try to retrieve the shadows in your editing software, they might tend to be muddy. On the right-hand side, we have an overexposed image where the highlights have lost details. And when we lose detail in the highlights, they are very hard or impossible to retrieve in the editing software. So these are very important notions to remember. Correctly exposed, underexposed, overexposed. The next very important concept is the photographic triangle. A correct exposure is a combination of three important factors. The first one is aperture, which is the lens opening. The second one is shutter speed, which is the exposure time. And then we have the ISO, which is the sensitivity of the sensor or the film. So here we have an example of three exposures. What we have to remember is that all scenes have multiple combinations of aperture and shutter speed that will give a correct exposure. However, there is only one that is the creatively correct exposure. So if we look on the top left, we do not see any movement. We have a shutter speed that really froze the action. On the bottom right, we start seeing movement. We have a slower shutter speed. On the upper right, we have a very slow shutter speed. And in my own opinion, I think that's the most creative exposure for this subject, which is a Ferris wheel, where we see the full motion 360 of the Ferris wheel. And also we start seeing a pattern of colors appearing through the movement of the light. So this is that's what I mean when I talk about choosing a creative exposure. Let's go in more detail. Let's talk about aperture. So the most important and creative function of aperture is to define the depth of field. The depth of field is the area of sharpness from near to far within a photograph. Aperture is expressed in f numbers that are called f-stops. So if you see on the left-hand side of our screen, we have a large aperture, which is f/2, and that gives us a very shallow depth of field where the front chest pieces are in focus and the back is blurred. On the right-hand side, we have an f-stop of f16 that gives us a very large depth of field where the front and the back chest pieces are in focus. The other thing to remember is that aperture controls the flow of light reaching the sensor. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we have a large aperture at f2.8 that is going to let lots of light into the camera, and that leads to a shallow depth of field where only the few first pencils in my image are going to be in focus. However, on the right-hand side of the screen, we have a very small aperture of f32, which is not going to let a lot of light in the camera, and that leads to a very large depth of field where all the pencils from front to back are going to be in focus. So that's what aperture does creatively to your image. There is a very important concept that I want you to understand, which is the stop increment. So what is a full stop increment? It's when you move the dial in your camera and you're going to change your aperture from f2.8 to f4, and then you go one stop up again, f4 to f5.6. In some cameras, you have also a 1/3 of increment that is available in between this full stop. So for example, you go from f2.8 by 1/3 to f3.2, then by 1/3 to f3.5, and then you'll reach the full stop of f4. So what does happen when you go up by a full stop? Well, when you go up from f2.8 to f4, you are going to reduce the hole of your aperture, and you are basically going to cut in half the light that is entering the camera. Reversely, when you stop down from f4 to f2.8, you are going to increase your hole to where you are going to double the light that is entering the camera. So that's what one stop does. It either doubles or halves the light that is entering your camera, whether you are going a stop up or a stop down. So for example, here between 2.8 and f6, I know I have two stops. Why? Because I go from 2.8 to 4 and then from 4 to 5.6. Same thing when I step from 5.6 to 11, I go up by two stops because I go from 5.6 to 8 and then to 11. And between 5.6 and f8, I've doubled the light that enters the lens. And same thing when I go from f8 to f11, I double the light that enters the lens. So I've basically quadrupled the light that is reaching my sensor by going up by two stops. So in the example here, I was shooting with a zoom lens at 200 millimeter, and my subject was this lady, and I used an aperture of f4.6 that was enough with a zoom lens to isolate her from the background. So you see her face and her clothing is fully in focus, but the background is blurred, and it brings emphasis on her. The opposite is this image that I've taken at 30 millimeter, a wider angle, and I have sharpness from the front of my image to the back. I have a very large depth of field, and I'm using an aperture, a small aperture of f16. Let's talk now about shutter speed. The creative function of shutter speed is either to imply motion or to freeze action. And shutter speed, as I've said before, stands for the length of time the camera shutter is open to admit light into the camera and expose light onto the camera sensor. As we saw in the previous Ferris wheel example, there are several possible combinations of aperture and shutter speed, but only one is the most creative one. So here on the left-hand side, I have a shutter speed of 1/120th of a second, where I'm barely seeing movement. However, on the right-hand side, I have a very slow shutter speed of 4 seconds, where I see the full movement of the Ferris wheel, which I think is a very creative exposure. So shutter speed is not only important when you want to show motion or freeze action, but it's also important when you are shooting in low light because it allows you to let more light into the camera when you shoot at a very slow shutter speed. But then you need to use a tripod, because what happens is that in order to avoid camera shake, you always need to keep a shutter speed of at least 1/60 of a second. Some people now are managing to shoot slower than that because we have image stabilizer on the lens. For me, I don't have a very stable hand, so I shoot at 1/60th of a second. And also something else to consider is that when you use a zoom lens that goes up, for example, from 70 to 300 millimeter, the slowest shutter speed that you can use is not 1/60 of a second, but it's 1 over the focal length of your lens, which means that you'll have to use 1/300 of a second. So you use whichever is greater, either 1/60 of a second or 1 over the focal length of your lens, or you have to use a tripod. The same thing then with aperture. With shutter speed, it's very important to understand the concept of a full stop increment. For example, between 1/15 of a second and 1/30 of a second, I have one stop. So what does that mean is that I'm going to increase my shutter speed. So basically my shutter is not going to be opened for as long. So I'm going to cut by half the light that is entering my camera. Reversely, when I go from 1/30 of a second to 1/15 of a second, I'm going to slow my shutter speed. So my shutter is going to be open for longer. So I'm going to double the amount of light that is entering my camera. So for example, here, when I go from 1/15 of a second to 1/60 of a second, I have 2 stops. I go up by 2 stops. How do I know that? Because I go from 1/15 to 1/30. That's 1 stop. So I'm decreasing the light by half because I have a faster shutter speed. Then I go from 1/30 to 1/60. Again, I'm decreasing the light by half because I'm going from 1/30 to over 60. Okay, so that's how it happens. And reversely, if I go from 1/60 to 1/30, I double the light. Well, from 1/30 to 1/15, I double the light again. So from 1/60 to 1/15, I quadruple the light that enters the camera. So this is what you have to know about going a stop up or a stop down. You are basically increasing or decreasing the light that is entering your camera. So here I'm using a shutter speed of 1/30 of a second, which is a good shutter speed for panning. So here my focus was on the face of the man, and I was moving my camera at the same speed than the motorbike. And so I was panning my camera and I pressed the shutter speed. That's what I call the creative exposure for this type of image. So the third parameter in the exposure triangle is ISO. ISO is the level of sensitivity of your camera sensor to available light. So the base ISO is the lowest ISO number of the sensor that can produce the highest image quality without adding noise to the image. Because higher ISO comes at an expense, it adds grain or noise to the images. And noise looks like tiny colored pixels or specks in your photograph in the digital world. It doesn't have the charm that the film grain had in the old times. So on the left here at an ISO of 100, we really have a clean image. Whether at ISO 3200 on the right hand side, we have a noisy image that is not that pleasing to the eye. So the lowest the ISO, the less sensitive to light is my sensor. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive to light is my sensor. So in sunlight conditions, I can use an ISO of 100. As it gets darker in low light, I will have to use a higher ISO of 400, 800, or 1600. Okay? What you have to understand is that each time I increase my ISO from 100 to 200, for example, I make it twice more sensitive, which means that I need half of the light for the same exposure. If on the opposite, if I've moved from 400 to 200, I will need double of the light because I'm decreasing the sensitivity of my sensor by half. So I need twice as much light. So now let's summarize what the creative exposure is. So for every subject or scene that is going to present itself to you, there is multiple aperture shutter speed combinations that are possible, but only one or two are creatively correct. So you're going to have to decide what is important in the story you are trying to tell. Is it aperture, where you want to have everything in focus, or you want to have some blurred background? Or is it shutter speed, where you want to show motion or freeze the action? And that will decide on the combination of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO that you want to use. So for example, storytelling exposures are small apertures where everything is sharp, between f16 and 32. Isolation exposures, where you want to emphasize your subject and have a blurred foreground or background, are large apertures between f2.8 and f5.6. And then in the middle of the road, you have what I call who cares apertures. And this is the sweet spot of your lens very often, where you are getting the most sharpness and contrast. This is like f8 and f11. But then if motion is the important thing in your image and you want to freeze action, you're going to use fast shutter speed of 1/250th of a second and above. Or if you want to imply motion, you are going to use super slow shutter speeds of 1/4 of a second or slower than that. And then there is the example of the motorbike I showed you, where I was panning, where I was holding my camera and following the movement of my subject. And there you are using slow shutter speeds between 1/60th of a second and 1/15 of a second. So that's what I call the creative exposure. You are going to have to identify what is the driving force of your image, what it is that is important, and what is the story that you are trying to tell, and pick what is the right combination of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So let's go back to our exposure triangle, and we're going to study a little bit the relationship between shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. So let's see that I have two sets of combinations that are possible for the image I'm about to take. One is in yellow and one is in red. However, I'm thinking that the red one, the shutter speed is too slow at 1/15 of a second. I'd like a faster shutter speed to show less motion. So basically, I'm going to increase my shutter speed by 2 stops, which means that I'm reducing the light by 2/2. And so I need to make sure if I'm reducing the light by increasing my shutter speed, I need to make sure that I increase the light by changing my aperture or my ISO or a combination of both. So basically what I'm going to do here, I'm going to reduce by one stop. I'm going to increase by one stop my aperture, and I'm having a larger hole and I'm letting more light in to compensate for my faster shutter speed. And I'm going to step up by one stop my ISO from 1600 to 3200. So I'm having a more sensitive sensor. I need less light. So I'm compensating here again for the reduced light by increasing my shutter speed. So that's what I did. I increased of 2 stop my shutter speed. So basically I compensated by increasing the light by 1 stop on aperture and 1 stop on ISO, which equals to 2 stops. If you're moving clockwise on the exposure triangle, you let less light in. And if you're moving, so that's the blue arrow. And if you're following the green arrows counterclockwise, you are letting more light in. So you need to make sure you compensate along these 3 lines. Let's move on now to the light metering system. At the center of the photographic triangle resides the light meter. The light meter measures the amount of light reflected from the scene and generates an average reading, and that translates into an exposure setting required for the scene you are shooting. So the light meter is really going to help you set the right aperture, shutter speed, and ISO combination. If you are in aperture priority, the light meter, you set the aperture, and the light meter is going to help you set the shutter speed and ISO. If you're in shutter speed priority, you set the shutter speed, and the camera is going to help you set your aperture and ISO. If you are in manual, you are the one who is going to use the light meter scale and really balance aperture, shutter speed, and ISO combination. So there are 3 light metering modes available. The first one is the evaluative metering. Evaluative metering is the default metering on most cameras, and I would say that it has a 90% accuracy. It works on most scenes and even some backlit scenes. So you should use this mode for most of your photographs from landscape to portrait photography. There is an important point to remember with evaluative metering is where your focus point is. Why? Because after reading exposure information from all the individual zones, the metering system looks at where you're focused within the frame and marks it as more important than all the other zones. So this is an image that was taken with evaluative metering mode on Canon or matrix metering mode on Nikon. The next metering mode is center-weighted metering, because sometimes using the whole frame to determine the correct exposure is not always desirable. What if you are trying to take a headshot of a person with the sun behind? This is where the center-weighted metering comes in handy. In this mode, the camera measures the light information originating from the middle of the viewfinder. This is the gray shaded area in the image. This setting causes the camera to focus on the subject in the middle of the frame and is not too influenced by any excessively dark or light backgrounds or sides of the frame. So here we have this image of this young lady, and the metering occurs on her face, and there is no distraction from the overexposed background. The thing to remember is that compared to matrix metering, center-weighted metering does not look at the focus point you select and only evaluates the middle area of the image. So for example, here the main subject is the mountain with its reflection in the lake, and that's why center-weighted metering can also be used in this case. The other two metering modes that you might want to experiment with is partial and spot metering for special light conditions. For example, overly black or white scenes with a main contrasting subject occupying only a small portion of the frame. So with spot metering that is available on both Canon and Nikon, the meters takes a reading from a very small area of the overall scene, about 3.5%. With partial metering that is only available on Canon, I call that an expanded spot metering, where the metered area is about 8 to 10%. So the spot metering is very useful, for example, in bird photography, because the bird mostly occupy a small area of the frame, and to expose them properly, whether the background is bright or dark, you do spot metering on the bird itself. The partial metering here, what you have to be careful with partial metering is that when your subject is overly backlit, it will enable a correct exposure of your subject, but your background might be overexposed. So what happens when you shoot manual or semi-manual? Well, you really have to know where your metering scale is on your back LCD panel or your smaller panel, or the light metering scale that you can see within your viewfinder. These are the three green screen capture at the bottom. So you need to identify where your light metering scale is. The other thing that you need to identify is where your tracking dot is, and that's going to tell you whether your image is properly exposed, overexposed, or underexposed. So let's run through an example if you were to shoot manual. And let's say that you know that you want a shutter speed that is about 125 because you want to freeze a little bit some movement. And then you're also going to have your lowest ISO possible, and it's 200 on your camera. And for a properly exposed image, your aperture is going to be f16. Okay? So now let's say that you force your aperture to go down by one stop to f11. So basically you are going to open up your aperture to a bigger hole, so you are going to let more light in, and you're going to end up with an overexposed image. Let's say now that you do the reverse. Instead of f16, you go to f22, which is a smaller aperture. It let less light in, and so you are going to end up with an underexposed image by one stop. So that's all you need to do to shoot manual. You need to understand how moving up and down by one stop, either the shutter speed, the ISO, or the aperture, is going to influence the exposure of your image, and you read that from the light meter scale. And there is something that you want to remember is if you are within 1/3 or 2/3 of a stop underexposed, your image can still be fine. You can refine it at processing time. However, if you are 2/3 overexposed, you run the risk to have your highlights overblown. So exposure compensation. How, when you have a standard exposure and you decide that I don't really like it, I want to overexpose it, or I'd rather have a darker mood, I want to underexpose it. How do you do that? Well, exposure compensation is something that allows you to do that, and it's available only in aperture priority and shutter priority modes. So here, and how do you control that? On my Canon 6D, I control it with the quick control dial, and I refer you to your camera manual to know how you do this on your camera. But let's say that here I have this beautiful tree with a sunset behind, and in the middle image, this is my standard exposure, properly exposed tree. But let's say that I want to see more detail in the tree, and I want to overexpose my image a little bit. Well, I will turn the quick control dial on my camera, and I can adjust the exposure by +1 or +2 to have an overexposed image. And I read that basically on the metering scale. On the other hand, if I want a darker silhouette and a darker image that is more moody, well, I can do the same thing, still with the quick control dial, but I underexpose it by -1 or -2. And again, you read that on your light metering scale. So exposure compensation, that's what's going to allow you to over or underexpose an image according to your taste. There is another thing that is available, and it's the auto bracketing. The auto bracketing is available from the menu in your camera. If you're unsure how to do it, again, check your camera manual. And so you need to go to your auto bracketing, and there you are going to set your bracket to whatever you want, either plus or -1 or plus and -2. You can all go by 1/3 or 1/2 of an increment. It depends on the camera. So you decide on the bracket that you want. So you set that in your menu, and then you are going to set your camera to continuous shooting drive mode, which means that when you press the shutter, you can take several images in a row without releasing your shutter. So when you press your shutter, your camera will take a first image at standard exposure. You keep your shutter pressed down, you don't release it, and it will take a second image underexposed by the bracket that you've set. Here it's set at -2. And then it will take a third image overexposed at the same bracket, but this time +2. So that's how you can do auto bracketing of your images. You do that from the menu, set your camera to continuous shooting drive mode, and press your shutter and keep your shutter down until your 3 images are taken. Then you can review them on your processing software and either overlay them or choose the one that has the best exposure for the message you're trying to convey. So there are situations that get tricky for the light metering system in the camera, especially when the scene is predominantly white or black. In fact, the camera doesn't see the world in color but in neutral gray, and neutral gray reflects 18% of the light that hits it. So when a scene is predominantly white, a lot of light is being reflected, and the camera tends to not let enough light in, and so your sand is therefore underexposed and turns into a gray color. So really, to get white sand, you have to overexpose your image by 2 stops compared to what the metering system tells you. The same thing happens for dark images, like photographing a black cat, but it's the opposite. The camera sees something that is very obscure and tends to let too much light in and turn your black cat into a gray cat. So you really need to underexpose your image by 2 stops compared to what the light metering system is indicating you in order to have a black cat. The same thing happens with some colors in nature. Some reflect light more than others, and that will affect a little bit your exposure. You might have to overexpose a bit or underexpose a bit with some colors. For example, if you have a scene that is predominantly green, like in nature, you might want to underexpose your image by 2/3 compared to what the light metering tells you. Now let's move on to the exercises for today. So for these exercises today, I would encourage you to go to Levy Park so that you can shoot under good lighting conditions outside. It will make it easier and you won't be running into low light situations. For this first exercise, you need to set your camera on aperture priority mode and pick a stationary subject to photograph. First, set your aperture to isolation aperture, which is a large aperture, 2.8, for example. Then you'll set your aperture to the sweet spot, f8 or f11. And then you choose a storytelling aperture, which is a small aperture. For each of these apertures, you are going to shoot 3 exposures, a correctly exposed image, and then using exposure compensation, you'll take one overexposed image by, for example, +1 or +2, and you'll take one underexposed image, for example, -1 or -2. Then you'll compare your images and see what you observe in the background. Is it blur? Is it sharp? In the highlights? Can I see some details in the highlights, or are they overblown? What about the shadows? So I'd like you to learn how to read your exposures so that next time you want to achieve a certain effect and convey a certain mood, you are really able to do it. For this reason, we are going to do the same exercise with the shutter priority mode. So you'll set your camera on shutter priority mode and you'll pick a moving subject to photograph, like a fountain or a waterfall. And you'll set your shutter speed to a shutter speed that freezes your subject and another one that shows motion. And for each shutter speed, you are going to take 3 exposures, one correctly exposed image, one that will be underexposed, and that one that will be overexposed. And you'll compare your images again and see what you observe in your subject, in your background, in the highlights, and in the shadows. The last exercise is to make sure that you get comfortable with manual mode. So again, please shoot outside and set your ISO at 200. And with the stationary subject, like a flower, you are going to try different aperture, isolation, sweet spot, and storytelling. And the camera won't adjust the shutter speed and the ISO for you because you'll be in manual mode. And so you'll have to do that yourself to get a correct exposure. But then I also want you to try to get a creatively correct exposure, where you are choosing the right aperture for the effect you are trying to achieve. Now I want you to do the same thing with shutter speed, where you are going to choose a subject that is in motion, a moving subject like a waterfall. And then again, you are going to use shutter speed that frees the subject or show motion and adjust the aperture and the ISO accordingly. And you'll make different exposures, but I want you to create one that is very creative. So basically for each subject, you will have a lot of images and I will ask you to choose the one that is the creatively correct exposure that has the wow factor. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and to post the images that you will have taken for this workshop on #LevyPark and #HCPOnline. You can also upload them on the Google Drive for the ones that have the link. Thank you very much for today, and I hope you will join me on Saturday morning for our Zoom Q&A. It will be from 9 to 10 a.m. and the information to access the Zoom meeting is on our Houston Center for Photography website under Education, Levy Park Workshops. Thank you and see you Saturday.